Hi there, welcome to the Forth Valley and West Lothian Supported Study Resource for Easter School. This recording is looking at National 5 History. Hi there, welcome to the Forth Valley and West Lothian Supported Study Resource for National 5 History. Our learning intentions for today are we are learning how to achieve full marks in each of the question types examined in the National 5 History course. Your success criteria for today is that I can structure my answers effectively and I can understand how to achieve full marks in each of the question types in the National 5 paper. So not only will you have a clearer understanding of exactly how you should put your answers together, but you should also be able to understand exactly how the marks are allocated and where each of the marks are coming from within the questions that you're going to be answering. For today's lesson, there's a few resources that you're going to be needing. What you will definitely need for today is either a pen or a pencil, some paper, so that might be a jotter or a notebook, whatever you would prefer, and a timer, especially if you're completing some of the questions that are going to be used in today's lesson. Now you can use a watch or you could use a timer on your phone for this. What you may want to have available is highlighters and post-it notes. These can be quite useful for you, especially if you're going to be doing some source questions later on, and post-it notes can be very useful for you to write notes and ideas to yourself, or if you have any questions that you would like to be answered later. Throughout today's lesson, you will see various symbols being used on the slides to indicate what you should do. On the screen that you see in front of you are the symbols that may be used and what they mean. The first symbol that you see is for you to listen. So as part of the recording, you're being asked to listen to the information that is being shared with you. The next icon is asking you to speak or to repeat the information that is being shared. The third icon is asking you to read the information that's on the screen in front of you. This may be going along with the listen icon. The fourth symbol that you see is asking you to write or copy the information that will be on the screen. The fifth symbol that you see is asking you to correct your work. And the final symbol that you see is asking you to pause the video to allow you to complete whatever task it is that's on the screen in front of you. So before we get started looking at the different question types in the National 5 History course, I just wanted to remind you of the structure for your assessed pieces of work. In the assessed pieces of work that you'll be completing over the next couple of months, you will be answering questions in 3 different sections. You will have questions on a Scottish context, a British context, and a European and world context. Each of the question types that we'll be looking at today appear in all 3 of the contexts that you see on the screen. Your history paper overall will be worth 80 marks, and in total it'll take you approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes to complete one full paper. You should speak to your teacher about the individual arrangements for your school. I wanted to share with you some helpful hints that should be useful to you for when you're completing assessments in the National 5 History course. One of the most important things that you can do is to make sure that you read your questions carefully before you attempt them. Make sure you understand what the question is asking you and take time to highlight any important or key words that are there in the question. You should also make sure that you check your timings for answering the question types themselves. Now this is something that we're going to be going over shortly as part of today's lesson. And finally, try to complete as many timed past paper questions as you can. This is very good practice and it'll help you to build your confidence for answering all of the different question types in the National 5 History course. At this point, we're going to start looking at the different question types that appear in the sections that you will complete in your National 5 History assessments. You'll be dealing with a number of different question types, which are both knowledge and source questions. Even though these have different structures for answering them, both of these types of questions will require you to have very good knowledge about each of the sections that you have studied. So the first question types that we're going to be looking at today are the knowledge questions. Throughout your assessed pieces of work, you will be answering 3 types of knowledge questions. The first one is the most straightforward. It's a describe question. A describe question will always be worth 4 marks, and it should take you approximately 6 to 7 minutes to complete it under timed conditions. If you are completing a describe question and you find that it doesn't take you the full 7 minutes to complete the question, you can take that extra time that you have left over and use it on questions that you find a bit more challenging or you're a wee bit more pressed for time with them. The second question that we're looking at today is an explain question. This is always worth 6 marks and it should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete under timed conditions. The final question for our knowledge section that we're looking at today is referred to as a 9-mark question or sometimes a short essay. It usually starts with to what extent, how important, or how successfully. This will always be worth 9 marks, and when we're completing it under timed conditions, it should take you approximately 15 to 16 minutes to complete. Now we're going to be taking just a wee reminder of our source questions and how long we should be taking to answer these in our assessed pieces of work. You will be answering 3 types of source questions. The first is evaluate the usefulness of source A as evidence of. An evaluate the usefulness question is always worth 5 marks, and when completed under timed conditions, it should take you roughly 8 to 9 minutes. The second type of source question is a how fully question. This will start with the stem of either how fully does source A describe or how fully does source A explain. A how fully question is always worth 6 marks, and when completed under timed conditions, it should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes. The final source question is a compare the views question. It's also called a source comparison question. This will always be worth 4 marks, and when completed under timed conditions, it should take you approximately 6 to 7 minutes to complete. So we're now going to take a wee bit more of a detailed look at how we go about answering a describe question. In its simplest form, a describe question is asking you to use your historical knowledge to provide a description of a historical event. Now, the information that you should give in a describe question should be accurate and clear historical facts. Now, as it's worth 4 marks, you can answer this question by providing 4 simple factual points, 2 developed points, or any combination of the 2. A describe question is more than just listing pieces of information, and the structure for answering this question is actually really important because this is a question where you can guarantee yourselves 4 out of 4 every time as long as you've been studying the information and you know the structure for approaching it. A suggested structure for answering a describe question is to keep it simple. Make sure that your marker can see exactly where you're giving your points of knowledge. I would suggest structuring your answer like this. Firstly, and then you give your first point of knowledge, and then a full stop. Secondly, give your second point of knowledge, full stop. Thirdly, your third point of knowledge, full stop. Finally, your last point of knowledge, full stop. What this allows your marker to see is that you've given 4 separate factual points, and they're clear that these are separate points that have been provided. It's really important in a describe question that you avoid combining your points. Make it as simple for your marker as you possibly can. We're now going to take a more detailed look at an explain question and how you go about answering an explain question. What this question is asking you to do is to provide 6 clear reasons as to why historical events happened, or explain the impact that they had. The main difference between a describe and an explain question: in a describe question, all you have to do is give the facts. In an explain question, you have to provide very clear links between your knowledge point and the question. Now you can gain your full 6 marks by providing 6 individual pieces of knowledge that are linked to the question, 3 developed points of knowledge that are linked to the question, or any combination of the 2. When answering an explain question, it's really important that you get your structure correct. When you start answering an explain question, I would suggest that you make sure each sentence begins with the words of the question. What that means for you is that you start each sentence with the words of the question, follow it with the word because, and then give your point of knowledge. We're now going to look at an example of an explain question, followed by an exemplar answer. Today's explain question has been taken from the 2018 SQA past paper, and it's from the Scottish context on the Wars of Independence. The question itself: explain the reasons why the succession of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, caused problems for Scotland after 1286. As this is an explain question, it's worth 6 marks. If this is a context that you study in your school, you can now pause the recording and complete the question. Alternatively, if you have your own past paper booklet or have access to the SQA past papers online, you can access an explain question and complete it under timed conditions. A reminder that this question should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete. So the information that you see on the screen now is an extract from the marking instructions for this particular question. If you have completed this question, then you can use the marking instructions that's available on the screen to correct your work. If you completed a different explain question, you can use the SQA marking instructions, go through them and find your explain question, and you can correct your work using those marking instructions too. We're now going to be looking at an exemplar answer, which shows how you could have structured an answer to this particular question. On the screen in front of you, you can see an example of an explain answer. Reading through it with you, one reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem was because there was no other direct heir to the Scottish throne. Another reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem is because Margaret was a girl, which meant that she couldn't lead the troops in battle. Another reason why the succession crisis was a problem was because she was only a child, so she couldn't lead the country. Another reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem was because she was foreign and had never lived in Scotland before. We're now going to have a look at how this particular answer was marked. In an explain question, we know that we have to start each sentence with the words of the question. We're then going to use the word because or something similar, and then we would follow that with a piece of knowledge. If we look through the explain answer on the screen, you can see every sentence starts with the words of the question. You can see it highlighted in green. One reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem was because. The part that then follows that is a piece of knowledge. There was no other direct heir to the Scottish throne. For that first sentence, 1 mark was awarded because a valid reason has been given that's linked to the question. The same applies to the rest of this answer. The second sentence, another reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem, there's the link to the question, is because. That indicates an explanation is going to follow. The part that you then see at the end of the sentence, Margaret was a girl, which meant that she couldn't lead the troops in battle, is a point of knowledge. So taking that full sentence together, 1 mark was awarded for a valid reason being given that's linked to the question. The same applies to the third and the fourth knowledge points that you see on the screen. For all of the reasons that have been given, they have been clearly linked to the question, and that's highlighted in green, and that's been followed with a point of knowledge. And that's how you should be trying to approach your explain answers to maximise your marks that are available. You may be asked to try and explain your points a bit further, and you can do that by providing additional detail or additional explanation that tells your marker a bit more about what you're trying to say. We're now going to look at the structure for a 9-mark question. This is sometimes called a 9-marker or a short essay, but you approach it in the same way. A 9-marker can have different question stems, and these can include how important, to what extent, or how successfully. Your questions may be an isolated factor question, which means that you would be asked about one factor in the question, and you would need to talk about that one plus other factors as part of your answer. Usually isolated factor questions start with the stem how important or to what extent. However, you may also have to deal with a judgment question, which means that you're being asked to look at both sides of an argument before making a decision. Usually, this will start with the question stem, how successfully. Across your assessed pieces of work, you will have to answer more than one 9-mark question, and that's why it's really important for you to know exactly where the marks are coming from so that it allows you to maximise your marks across the paper. In a 9-mark question, your marks are allocated as follows. For your introduction, you get 1 mark. Now you can get that mark in a couple of different ways, but the most straightforward way for you to gain your mark is to list your factors. In your introduction, you need to have at least 2 factors for you to be given the mark. Usually what we would suggest is that you would start your introduction with the words of the question and then go on to mention the factors you're going to be talking about in your 9-marker. You get 5 marks in your 9-mark question for knowledge. This should be clear factual points that are relevant to the question. Again, avoid listing your information. Try to separate it out so it's clear to your marker that you're making separate points. If you only present one factor, or you're only talking about one issue within your 9-marker, the maximum knowledge marks that you could receive is 3. So it's really important that you have a good spread of knowledge to allow you to access all of the marks within this particular question. You also get 1 mark for something called balance. Usually this is something you don't really have to think about very much, as long as you have linked at least 2 of your factors to the question. Now the easiest way for you to do this is simply by starting each knowledge point with the words of the question, just like you would do when you're completing an explain answer. Your conclusion is worth 2 marks. This is a really important 2 marks, and it's actually very easy for you to pick up the marks for this. In your conclusion, you have to make a clear judgment on the question. If this is an isolated factor question, the way that you would do that is by identifying what is the most important factor in your question. If it's a judgment question, you get your judgment mark simply by answering the question directly. You pick up your second mark in your conclusion by giving supporting evidence to back up the judgment that you've made. Your conclusion should really use information that you have already mentioned in your 9 marker. So we're now going to look at an example of a 9-mark question and an exemplar answer. This question has been taken from the 2018 SQA past paper, and it's from section 2 and it's from the Making of Modern Britain context. The question itself: to what extent were free school meals the most successful of the liberal reforms for the young? If this is a section that you have already studied in your school, at this point you can pause the recording and you can attempt the question. If you don't study the Making of Modern Britain, you can access the SQA past papers online and you can find a 9 marker on a section that you have studied in your school, and you can complete it under timed conditions as well. What you now see on the screen is an extract from the marking instructions for this question from the SQA. If you have completed this question, then you can use the information on the screen to correct your work. If you completed a different question from the SQA past papers, you can use the marking instructions that are available online to correct your own work as well. So we're now going to look at an example of a 9-mark introduction, knowledge and conclusion. So the example introduction that you see in front of you: there were many successful liberal reforms for the young. Free school meals was an important reform, but there were other important reforms too, such as the Children's Charter. The first sentence that you see there directly answers the question. The second sentence, which includes free school meals and Children's Charter, which you can see underlined, lists the factors that's going to be discussed in this 9-mark answer. So overall, for this introduction, 1 mark was given, because at least 2 factors have been identified, and you can see them underlined on the screen in front of you. So we're now going to have a wee look at examples of knowledge and exactly where marks would be allocated for this particular answer. So we can see the answer in front of us just now. In 1906, the Free School Meals Act was passed, which gave local councils the opportunity to serve free school meals to poor children. It was paid for through taxes and quickly became a huge success as thousands of children received free meals. At this point, we're now going on to another paragraph. The Children's Charter was also a very successful reform. This was very successful as the Act stated it was now illegal for children to beg on the streets, which was successful because many cases of child abuse started with children begging on the streets. Where the marks were allocated in this answer, you can see indicated on the screen. So the first point in the first paragraph: in 1906 the Free School Meals Act was passed, which gave local councils the opportunity to serve free school meals to poor children. That was given a mark for knowledge. The last part of that paragraph, you can see it underlined. It says huge success as thousands of children receive free meals, provided a link to the question. The second paragraph starts with a link to the question. The Children's Charter was also a very successful reform. This is directly answering the question that has been set. The part that follows that is given a mark for knowledge. So across the 2 paragraphs that you see on your screen, 2 marks were given for knowledge and 1 mark was given for balance. The knowledge points that have been provided are clear, specific and relevant to the issue that's being asked about. The balance mark has been given because at least 2 factors have been mentioned and they have both been linked to the question. So we're now going to look at an example of a conclusion. This is a really nice example to show you as a way of highlighting to you that you can pick up the marks for a conclusion in a really clear and concise way. In your National 5 history paper, your timings are really important, and there isn't a lot of opportunity for you to waste time giving information that's irrelevant or doesn't really answer the question. So it's very important for you to make sure that your language is clear, concise, and links directly to the question that has been set. The example that you see in front of you: in conclusion, the Free School Meals Act was the most successful liberal reform for the young. This is because it gave all poor children the chance to have one decent meal per day. So for those 2 sentences, 2 out of 2 would be given. The first sentence gets 1 mark for making a judgment. What we can see in that sentence is that the Free School Meals Act has been identified as the most important and most successful liberal reform for the young. This is a really important part of an isolated factor 9-mark question. In your conclusion, you have to identify what is the most important, and that's what this example does. The second sentence is given 1 mark for giving evidence that backs up that judgment. Now this is where it's really important to make sure that whatever evidence that you're giving in your answer links clearly to your question and your judgment. If in doubt, make sure that you proofread your work to make sure it makes sense. Okay, so at this point I would call a checkpoint. You can pause the recording and take a few minutes just to take a breather. We have covered quite a lot of information already so far, so really well done for getting to this point. And what I would encourage you to do is to look back over the notes that we've looked at so far today on the knowledge questions, so the describe, the explain and the 9-marker, and just confirm and check with yourself that you understand the structure and mark allocation for each question. If you're still not sure, make a wee note of it to yourself and remember to ask your teacher the next time that you have contact with them. So we're now going to move on and have a look at our source questions, and we're going to begin today with an evaluate the usefulness question. Now what this question is asking you to do is to read through a historical source and comment on its usefulness in terms of the content of the source, so the information that's in the source omission, so what the source fails to tell us, the authorship of the source, which is who wrote the source, the timing of the source, which is when the source was written, the type of source that it is, and the purpose of the source. Now you may have been shown a particular structure for answering this question in school, and if that's a structure that you're comfortable with, then that's what you go ahead with. However, I am going to be showing you a structure that will allow you to maximise your marks for this particular type of question. We're now going to look at a suggested structure that would allow you to maximise your marks for this particular type of question. You start by commenting on the content of the source, and you would structure it just the way you see it on the screen just now. You select a relevant quote from the source that answers the question, and you structure it in the sentence. Source A says, you give your quote, which is useful because it is accurate. It's very important in this particular part of your answer to tell me that the source is useful because it is accurate, and you do this twice. It's 2 separate quotes and 2 separate comments, and the comment that you keep using for the content of the source is telling me it's useful because it's accurate. The second thing that you look to do is to comment on source omission. So there's 2 marks available for the content of the source and 2 marks available for source omission. If you are able to structure your answer correctly and pick up both of the marks for content and both marks for source omission, then you've guaranteed yourself already 4 out of 5. How you structure your comment on source omission is to say the source is limited because it fails to mention, and again you do this twice. Now on the screen you can see suggested comments on authorship and timing. In your school you may also comment on the purpose and the type of the source, and if this is something that you're comfortable with, then that's absolutely fine. However, you may prefer to just comment on author and timing, which again is also fine. There's one comment available for authorship and one comment available for timing. How I would suggest that you structure your part on authorship is to say source A was written by, and you must name the author. It's not enough to give a vague general comment. If you are told the specific name of the author, you have to tell me that. If you're told something like source was written by a modern historian, then for that part of your answer you would say source A was written by a modern historian, and the part that follows that is your explanation of why that is or it isn't useful. You have very similar structure for timing. So source A was written in, and you must name the date. It's not enough to say it's a primary or a secondary source. If you're given the specific date that a source is written, you must tell me that. The explanation that follows is to say this makes the source useful or less useful, and we'll look in just a minute at the explanations that you could give for this particular part of your answer. Okay, so all that we're looking at here is some possible comments that you could give on certain aspects of the source to allow for full source evaluation. So I've already looked at how you deal with the content and source omission within a source, but things like authorship, timing, purpose and type of source will all be different depending on the source that you have been given. So you can see on the screen, generally, there's 2 types of author. There might be a variation in amongst that as well, and that's something that your teacher will talk through with you. But for the vast majority of sources, there's 2 types of author. There's someone who was there, or the author's a historian. And you can see the comments for both of them. If the author is someone who was there, and remember you would tell me who that person was, your comment for that is that it's useful because this person was an eyewitness who saw, and then whatever the historical event is, you would name it. If the person is a historian, it's a standard comment that you use. A historian is useful because this person is an expert who will have good historical knowledge about the event. For timing, again, there might be some differences or some variations in timing, and that's something your teacher would talk to you about again. But for the majority, you would either have a primary source, which is a source taken from the time of an event, or a secondary source, which is a source that's produced after the time of an event. Remember, as part of your answer, you would have to name what the date is, so please make sure that you're reading your sources very carefully. Your comment, if the source is primary, is to say it's useful because it's taken from the time of, and you have to name the event. It is not enough to say it's taken from the time of the event. You have to name what the event is. History has got lots of different periods of time, so it's very important for you to be as specific as you possibly can. If the source is a secondary source, again, we have quite a standard response that you would have there, which is to say the source is useful because it has been written with the value of hindsight. Now, hindsight means that the historian has gathered together lots of sources of information, they've looked at it overall, and they're then looking back on the event with the benefit of having that additional information. And again here, what we can see is 2 other aspects of the source, the type and purpose of the source, the area of the source that you could comment on, and some possible comments. Now, again, I'm sure that a lot of your teachers will have already gone through this with you, but just for some of the common types of source and the common types of purpose for sources, just looking at some of the comments that you could make for that. So if a source is a textbook, a possible comment for that would be it's useful because it's likely to have been well researched. If it's an interview, it's useful because it's more likely to contain honest, accurate information. Purpose of a source, generally speaking, is one of two. The purpose of a source is usually either to influence or to inform. Now, a source that influences may be less useful because it may contain evidence of bias. However, you would need to read the source to see if that was the case. However, it may also be the case that a source designed to influence could be more useful because it provides an accurate representation of attitudes of the time. A source that's been written to inform is useful because it's likely to contain accurate and balanced information. So we're now going to look at an example of an evaluate the usefulness question and an exemplar answer. Source A has been taken from a textbook written by modern historians, published in 2013. The source itself is taken from the free at last topic in the European and world context. The source tells us slavery had been abolished in the 1860s, but the southern states of the USA used Jim Crow laws to maintain a segregated society. Black children were forbidden to attend school with white children. At work, Black Americans collected their pay separately from whites. There was also strict bans on blacks and whites marrying. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that such segregation of black people from white people was acceptable. Their ruling was called the separate but equal decision. The question itself: evaluate the usefulness of source A as evidence of the ways in which the Jim Crow laws segregated black and white Americans. At this point, if this is a question that you would have completed in your school if you study the free at last topic, you can pause the recording and you can complete the question that you see on the screen. If you don't complete the free at last topic in your school, you can access the SQA past papers online and you can find and evaluate the usefulness question in one of the sections that you do study, and you can also complete it under timed conditions. Just a reminder that this question should take 8 to 9 minutes for you to complete under timed conditions. So at this point, I would be asking you to use the information on the screen to correct your answer. If you did not complete the free at last evaluate the usefulness question, you can use the marking instructions available from the SQA website for the evaluate the usefulness question that you have selected. So we're now going to take a look at an evaluate the usefulness exemplar answer to see how marks would be allocated. From what you can see on the screen, source A says black children were forbidden to attend school with white children. This makes the source useful because it is accurate. Source A also says at work, black Americans collected their pay separately from whites. This makes the source more useful because I know it is accurate. For the 2 points that you see here, 2 marks would be given. Two correct quotes have been identified from the source, and the explanation, the source is useful because it's accurate, have also been given. The second part of the answer that you see on the screen is from the source omission. However, the source does not mention how blacks and whites had separate toilets, which makes the source less useful. The source also does not mention how blacks and whites had separate water fountains, which makes the source less useful. 2 marks were also picked up for this part of the answer. So overall, what you see on the screen, currently this answer would receive 4 out of 5. So for the rest of the answer, the source was published in 2013. It has the benefit of hindsight, which makes the source more useful. 1 mark has been given here for timing. We can see clearly that the date has been identified, 2013, and the explanation has been given. We can see in the answer that the source is more useful, and the explanation is because it was written with the benefit of hindsight. The second part of the answer, the source is from a textbook, which means it will be well researched and not biased, which makes it more useful. 1 mark here was also given for type. In the answer, we can see the type of source and an explanation on why this is useful. So we're now going on to look at our second source question, which is a how fully question. In your assessed pieces of work, you will deal with 2 types of how fully questions. You'll see how fully does source A describe and how fully does source A explain the reasons why. Now, these are slightly different questions, but you still deal with them in the same way. What I would look out for in the how fully does source A explain question, you must be very, very careful to make sure that the points that you give as recalled knowledge are linked to the question. You could approach this in the same way that you would do a knowledge explain question and make sure that you're using the words of the question where possible. So now we're going to look at the structure for dealing with a how fully question. Now, no matter whether it's a how fully describe or a how fully explain, you approach it in the exact same way. And it really needs a very clear structure. So the first step in a how fully answer is to make a judgment on the source. And I've given you an example on the screen of how you could do that. You could say something like source A partly, or source A to an extent either describes or explains, and at that point you would use the words of the question. Without the judgment, the maximum that you could receive for your answer is 2 out of 6. So it's really, really important for you to make sure that you have a nice clear judgment on the source that tells your marker that you know that the source isn't giving the complete picture. The source is only telling us a part of the story. The second step in your answer is to identify what the source does tell us. And how you can approach that is by saying source A says, and then you would give a quote from the source that answers the question. You would do this 3 times because there's 3 marks available for quotes from the source in a how fully question. Your teacher may have asked you to explain your quotes or try to put them into your own words. If this is how you've been completing your answers throughout the year, you can continue it this way. If your teacher has told you that you can just quote from the source, you can also complete it this way. The most important thing for you to remember when you're taking information out of a source in a how fully question is to make sure that the information that you're selecting directly answers the question. And remember that you need 3 quotes or 3 pieces of information from the source. The third step in your answer is to identify what the source has missed out. This is your recalled knowledge. How you could structure that is to say source A is limited as it fails to mention. And you would give your recalled knowledge at this point. You also do this 3 times. What you can see from the screen is that you don't get a mark for making a judgment on the source, but making that judgment allows you to access the full 6 marks in your answer. So you have to go through these 3 steps for you to pick up the full 6 marks overall. The final type of source question that we're going to be looking at today is a source comparison question. This type of question will usually start with the phrase, compare the views of sources A and B about. What you're being asked to do here is to look at the 2 sources and identify the similarities or differences between them. Remember, in a source comparison question, this will be worth 4 marks and it should take you about 6 to 7 minutes to complete. What's also very important for you to remember when answering this question is that you don't need any recall knowledge in this answer. Absolutely everything that you need to answer this question is in the source. So please make sure that you're reading it really carefully when you're going through your paper. A helpful hint I would suggest to you is when you are completing a source comparison answer, you try to use 2 different coloured highlighters or pens or pencils when you're reading the sources. What you can do is use them to highlight the points from the source that match up with each other, and that will make it easier for you to see the comparisons when you're actually writing out your answer. So we're now going to look at the structure for answering a source comparison question. I would encourage you to try to use the following structure to give you the best chance of maximising your marks. Step 1 is worth 1 mark. And really all you're having to do here is to look at the 2 sources and decide if they agree or disagree, and then you use the words of the question. And you can see on the screen how you would structure that. Step 2 is also worth 1 mark, and at that point you're being asked to refer to the sources. You can quote in a source comparison question, and how you would approach it is by saying source A says, you give your first quote, and then source B agrees or disagrees when it says, and you give your second quote. From there we would go on to step 3, which is also worth 1 mark. At that point you're going to sum up the comparison from the quotes that you have just given. So this proves that sources A and B agree or disagree about, and you go back to the 2 quotes that you've just given and you sum up that area of comparison. It doesn't matter which order that you do steps 2 and 3 in. You might find that in your school, your teachers asked you to sum up the area of comparison before you give the quotes, and that's absolutely fine. You would still be given the mark for that. For the rest of your answer, because this is still worth 4 marks, then you repeat steps 2 and 3, and that would allow you to access the full marks for this question. It's worth bearing in mind again that there's no recall involved in this answer, and it's a really good opportunity for you to boost your marks across the paper. Just make sure that you've learned the structure for dealing with this particular question. So we've now come to the end of our lesson for today. What we have been looking at is the best ways and approaches for you to maximise your marks for the National 5 History course. What you should now be able to do is structure your answers effectively, and you should now understand how to achieve full marks in each of the question types examined in the National 5 History course. So some suggested next steps for you to continue building your confidence and your skills in National 5 History. One of the most important things that you can do is to use the SQA past papers that are available online, and you can see the link where you can access that. You'll find the question papers and marking instructions, which will allow you to review any questions that you have completed at home. It would also be worth looking at each question type again, reviewing your knowledge and reviewing any notes that you've made on them, and then ranking each question type in order, starting with the one that you feel the least confident in and working your way up to those that you feel most confident in. This is a really effective way of helping you prioritise what you need to do for your own next steps for going ahead for your assessed pieces of work. This is going to help you identify the question types that you need the most practice on, and it helps you to prepare for any future questions that you will need to complete in school. I would just like to say an absolutely massive thank you to all of you for listening to me today. You've done an absolutely fantastic job, and I really hope that this has been useful to you in helping you to understand exactly where your marks are coming from in your National 5 History paper. I wish all of you the absolute best of luck for the future. Thanks again.